Hi, I'm Phil Ball, pastor of Odyssey Christian Church in Jenks, Oklahoma. We're part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we offer a non-judgmental approach to support your personal journey of faith. After the message, we invite you to keep listening for a presentation from our wonderful band. And if you want to experience worship live, we invite you to find out all the details at www.facebook.com/Odyssey CC.
Well, gosh, I'm onto this thing of epiphany called the Jesus paradigm, because constantly what Christ did was shift our paradigms from how we view stuff. And anytime anybody does that, in America today, they call them a flaming liberal, because they're always coming in, changing our brains. You know, they want us to do something different than what they did before. And it's them crazy people that do all that. But man, when I read the New Testament, and tonight's just another one of those times, Sermon on the Mount, right after he gets finished with the Beatitudes and gets into to salt and light, then he starts moving in another direction. And I called it, as a subtitle, Excessive Righteousness. And because for those of us who have a hard time doing it, it's excessive. But I believe that God is always moving in and through history. That God is not dormant. God does not sit on God's front porch with a beer. He's not nothing against beer, and just do nothing. Okay, God's always moving. And some of the times when God moves, it's uncomfortable. It's like there's this struggle that goes on, and it's just so symbolic when I think of it, because if you study the formation of the universe from a scientific standpoint, and you start learning how all these different atoms of hydrogen and things start coming together, and I don't know all the different gases that they use, but nothing but their own gravity pull them together so tightly that they just burst into a sun and start going. And in the cauldron, all this heat and intensity, this new stuff gets born. And even when these galaxies crash, or there'll be a big dwarf star that hooks up with another star, and the kind of stuff that happens between them creates the element of iron. I mean, it's like, holy moly, that's why we have all these elements, 100 and something in our Earth, because throughout 15 to 13 billion years, all this stuff has just been forged. And it didn't happen in a nice Sunday afternoon. I mean, it went through a lot of kind of stuff. The way the Nicene Creed was formed is the people with the most troops outside the conference center won. And it's like there's all this thing that Jesus does. And so I want us to get into it. And so right after the Beatitudes and salt and light, this is what you read. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of the letter will pass from the law until it is accomplished, which sets it into a process. And it's in a motion, it's in a movement. It's that we fulfill through this movement of accomplishment, that it's going to be that way. And so Jesus does that, and Jesus pushes us to go deep into the depth of law and what's behind it, rather than just do the surface. And get at what that's about. And that's how he fulfills it, as he points beyond it. And he offers a new paradigm, and it has to do with a relationship. And so let's read the next text. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Did you notice that both people are in the kingdom of heaven? You could say, well, if you break them and you teach others to break them, then you're kicked out. But that's not the text. He includes all of us in there, breakers and non-breakers and stuff like that. And then he goes to the next text. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, who were the primary law keepers of the day, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so that's what we're about. The scribes and the Pharisees, reflected in Matthew's gospel, live out of a superficial rendering of the law, and it's easy to do because they just live out of that left brain literal part of the law. And Jesus is already beginning to point to a higher moral development. Okay? And so in order to make this make any sense, we got to look at the word righteousness, because we've all played with that word before, or hopefully you've heard it before. When I first heard it, before I knew it was any religious, I thought it meant that the fruit had stayed on the tree too long. It was too ripe. It would become righteous. But I figured out it doesn't have anything to do with it. But let's look at righteousness just for a minute, okay? And God's faithfulness is where we hear that, and that righteousness is there. And I want to go down through this really quickly to read this blue stuff that's up there, and then we got some other things to go on, and why Dennis was so nice enough to play the walk-in music that he did. That God's faithfulness to his promise to us, to the covenant, is an important characteristic of righteousness. Therefore, faithfulness is a characteristic of righteousness. Righteousness are those who trust that they will be vindicated by God no matter what happens. And Jesus even alluded that last week when he was talking about who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake, for my sake, and with a blessing there. And so trust is involved in righteousness. And the Hebrew word for righteousness means integrity, equity, and justice. So that whole piece of equity and justice and integrity is there, and that it is best understood as the product of an upright moral action in accordance with some divine love. And so it's being in harmony with God and ourselves. Now, we can talk about that as a concept, but I've got another pick of that. Joe hit me with that pick. Hopefully it'll click in. Now you get into righteousness. Okay, because these two guys, called the Righteous Brothers, were prominent in the 60s and the 70s. And how they got the name of the Righteous Brothers was they were two white guys singing in blues clubs on the West Coast. And all the people, the patrons of the blues clubs, when they would finish a set, they would go, "Man, that was righteous." Okay. And because that was a term of the day, but it was really talked about that those guys who sang those songs, the Righteous Brothers, what the songs they sang, they had the harmony of that. Are you with me? They were faithful to the spirit of that music, that when they sang that stuff, you felt it. And they didn't have to be African American to sing it. They had it there, and the people who were listening going, "Dude's righteous," okay? Because it's not just a name; it's the essence of what they did. They were in harmony with that stuff. They were talking about what came out of themselves. When Bill Medley came here a couple of years ago, or whenever it was, we got to hear him, and he told us this story, his voice, I mean, to tell you, it just sounds righteous when he starts singing, even today, as old as he is. And it just takes you in the zone. It's something that's spiritual. It's not just a description of stuff like that blue stuff, but it points at that spiritual piece. And I want you to get a sense of what it feels like, that's why the Bible holds up righteousness. And so when Jesus says your righteousness needs to be that more than that of the people who live a superficial life, that's kind of what he's trying to get at, so that we learn in a spiritual way that righteousness resonates with being in harmony with all of that stuff. And we're in a spiritual harmony with God's love. In fact, I would even share with you a definition of responsibility that I learned a long time ago that was imaged as a triangle, with responsibility being at the top. And that, responsibility is a very subjective term. Like, how do you be responsible when, if you're responsible to one person, this happens. If you're responsible to another person, this happens. And you're caught in the middle. And the people that taught me about this said that if responsibility was at top, there was a corner and a corner. And the corner over here was total freedom. And the corner over here was total obedience. And that in obedience, it wasn't, "Yes, sir, I'll do what you say, sir." It was how you align yourself with that which is true. Obedience is an aligning with, so that you align yourself. And that responsibility was a movement that was a tension between total freedom, absolute freedom out of grace that you're always accepted, and total obedience. and the tension that lives there, that somehow as you danced between that tension of total freedom and total obedience, you were able to discern some kind of responsible action. Now, when you walk out of here tonight, you probably will be just as confused as you were when you came in. But I want you to have that metaphor in your brain, because the next time you go into a circumstance or a situation where you have to make a subjective decision, it's that you're living in those kind of tensions all the time. And that's the kind of thing that happens. When you stay in that path, you show up as a person who lives in righteousness. Now, that gets you started, but now we're going to dump into 2 slides, and then we're going to finish off. And these 2 slides are this way. As soon as Jesus says those things that he just said, he says this: "You have heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." And then there's a whole paragraph after that I'm going to read in a minute, because I want you to get clear. You have heard it said. You shall not commit adultery. You have heard it said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. You have heard it said, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you have made to the Lord. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Okay? That was the tradition. That was exactly, those are 6 statements that were tradition. There are 613, binding commandments on or Jews and laws in the Jewish tradition. And these are 6 ones that Jesus pointed out and lifted up. But then he did something that in a meeting, I'll tell you, if you go to work and you're having a meeting, if you start this, you're going to have trouble the same way Jesus did, because you have done it this way, but I'm going to say to you, do it a new way, okay? Because the next thing he says is, but I say to you. You have heard it said, but I say to you. And then he starts a new thing. But I say to you, you have heard it said in those ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, he goes into this business. There's been more sermons done on just these little segments where you take one of them. And you think I'm a little crazy trying to cover them, but I'm not trying to cover them. I'm trying to get you the idea that Jesus is moving us to a new value system, where you have heard it said, but I say to you, operate out of a different level of care, not just what you can get out of it. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But if I say to you, everyone who looks at an opposite sex person, in here it's sexist, the Bible is so sexist. If anyone who looks at a woman with lust, all right, or a woman looks at a man, is already committed adultery with it in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to sin, that stuff, it's like, are you crazy? We'd all be walking around blind quadriplegics. Okay, you know what I'm saying? You throw out your side, and you throw out that eye, and you cut off this arm, because they all caused you to sin. Well, but see, to take it literally is to turn it into a law, and that's not what Jesus is about. He's about getting in behind it all. He's about getting underneath it to say, what does it mean for you to recognize issues that are underneath the rules? Whoever divorces a wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone who divorces a wife except for a ground of unchastity causes to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus is talking about how important it is to hang in there. But in his time, honestly, he was talking about that Jewish man, all he had to do was write out, you are divorced, and do it in front of some other elders. And she was out on her own with nothing whatsoever. And Jesus is saying there's another higher value of care here that I want you to adhere to. Again, you've heard it was said in those ancient times, you shall not swear falsely or carry vows. But basically what Jesus says is your character needs to be so good that all you have to say is no. You don't have to swear it. That people know that once you say no, that's the truth. That's the way it is. He operates underneath that. You've heard that it was said, an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say you do not resist an evildoer. That's tough stuff. I mean, we got a big gun debate now. What does all that mean? If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. There's a whole nother level of care. And I would say that number 5 right there got the British out of India. Okay? A guy named Mahatma Gandhi pulled that off by doing number 5. Is that number 5 up there? Yeah. He was able to just throw their bodies in that face, and because the British were civilized enough, they recognized that something needs to change because they were not going to fight them with weapons. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Number 6. In the day that was established, that was high moral development. Because in the day that was established, if you wounded me, I would kill you and maybe your family. So to establish a higher moral development in that day was to say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus takes it and fulfills it with another thing. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He lifts it to a whole other thing. And I think that one of the things I'm out to go with you guys is to say, experiment with these things. It is a tradition in all of Christianity that nobody can live up to these. Everybody already knows that, okay? Because it requires a whole nother level of moral development and faith that all of us are working on. It's a process. And so I would suggest to you that if you want to experiment with these, pick the last one. It's the easiest and sometimes does the most good, okay? I can testify to you that there's a couple of people who over the last number of many years have been challenging to me. And I figured out about a year ago that if I would put that individual in my prayers every day and pray that their life got better, and that's under my, I have a category of a paragraph of my prayers in the morning. They're called help and heal. That's my category. And I put this person under help and heal. And I will stand before you and say, I have seen an amazing marked difference, not necessarily in our relationship, even though it's good too, but in the transition that's happened in this person's life. And I'm not going to tell you it's all because of my prayer, but I'm telling you that's a great place to start. And so Jesus has moved all that. And if you ever wonder why the Pharisees and Sadducees wanted to get rid of him, nice example. You have heard it said, all that stuff that's traditional, but I'm changing it. Okay? Here's the Messiah, the Son of God, changing everything in these kind of ways. And I just see him doing that over and over and over again. So he's lifting all of us to be challenged by this higher moral development. And it doesn't mean that we're bad or we're kicked out if we don't make it. You know, if we still have all of our arms and legs and eyes and stuff like that keep hanging in there. Try those values on. And I want to talk to you about what that might look like. Just had a meeting this week. Go ahead, Joe, hit the next one. Wasn't with anybody around here, none of you guys, another meeting altogether, hooked up with the Northeast area. And it's a typical traditional meeting where we've got to try to care for an organization, and I'm the chairperson of this group, okay? And one of the things I impose upon them to some degree is that we don't vote. Y'all have had experiences with me with that. That we do things by consensus so that everybody talks. And one of the things I do when I'm handling that is I say, does anybody want to speak to this? And is everybody okay with this? If you're not okay with this, please say something. And I wait. And the whole establishment of that acceptability. And we came to a point where we were having a conversation about a person's salary. And one of the individuals had to call for a vote. Okay, well, I'm not, God has taught me not to be throw down, draw the line, okay? And so I accepted the fact that he wanted to do a motion, And I said, anybody against this? And nobody was against it. And I said, sounds like it's unanimous. Okay? But another occasion, too, even after I explained to them this thing, when we vote, 49% loses, 51% wins. In the Christian concept, we're trying to care for everybody. Now, we may not be able to, but we're going to try. And that's the reason we're going to do consensus, that if somebody disagrees with something we're doing, what I want to do is hear their point. I want to hear what they're saying and what they're getting. And then we got to figure out a way that we can care for them, too. We got to figure out a way to try to help them be happy. I said, if I can get 14-year-olds to, 20 14-year-olds to decide on where we're going to eat, we ought to be able to work this out, okay? But they didn't get it, okay? And this one individual will not change, and that's okay. I'll deal with him next month too. And I'm just saying that's, in my mind, the same thing that Jesus did when he brought a new level of moral development. It's another level in which we don't try to have who winners and losers. And I'm not proposing to you that we do that in national politics. I'm just saying that when you get a group of Christians together, you try to work on how do we care for everybody? How do we get things done to where we care for everybody? And the fact that we even do that brings it to another moral level. And I'm just telling you that in your life and in your group, when we listen to what Jesus says, I think he is in business to help us live transformative lives. Okay? And I wish I had a really exciting story for you that was real compassionate, but for me, this is the kind of stuff that really is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we grow in faith. When we are challenged ourselves to make a statement of trust in this direction, when we move in this direction, we find great benefits. And it isn't status, it's the experience of righteousness. Let us pray. Dear God, we come to you in thanksgiving that you have challenged us. And I need to tell you that sometimes it's not very comfortable, but we begin to see things transform when we follow your way and new life happen. And that's what we hope for. We hope that as it evolves and as we move forward, that you can make us be those people who see the power in your Spirit and the power in your Son. And we give you thanks. Amen.
It's called Better Is One Day by Matt Redman. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. For my soul longs and even faints for you. For here my heart is satisfied within your presence. I sing beneath the shadow of your wings. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere, than thousands elsewhere. One thing I ask, and I would seek to see your beauty, to find you in the place your glory dwells. One thing I ask, and I would seek to see your beauty, to find you in the place your glory dwells. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. My heart and flesh cry out for you, the living God. Your spirit's water to my soul. You've tested and I've seen. Come once again to me. I will draw near to you. I will draw near to you. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts, thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts. Better is one day in your house. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. And thousands elsewhere.